Hello, Jeff Dishy here again. Today I'm going to talk about a topic which comes up a lot in terms of what I deal with all the time and what I'm doing with open autonomy. And it's something that I find that in a lot of conversations with people, they point out that it's not really clear what this is, and there's a lot of assumptions that come along with it. And so I think it's actually worth describing in terms of what it actually means, what it meant historically, and what it means going forward. So today is all about walled gardens. Now, walled gardens often go by other terms. Often we'll refer to it as something like a closed platform or a closed ecosystem. And these are actually kind of just slightly more technical ways of describing the same thing. What they actually are is a system where a single provider has control over all the applications and content on this within the actual platform or ecosystem itself. Now, this generally refers to software, not software development so much as the software industry. So how you actually run programs on devices and things like that. But historically, it actually applied to the broader telecommunications industry itself. So back when the phone systems were first being implemented, they were actually controlled usually by national monopoly. So you'd have things like one company that controlled all the back-end equipment that actually kind of managed the way the phone calls work and the way the switching systems were implemented, and also owned all the wires, all the lines, all the actual physical copper that the calls went over. But they also even owned the telephone. So this led to some really bizarre problems, like that one monopoly starting to sue companies who were trying to make new kinds of phones or even phone attachments, because as far as they were concerned, it was violating something which they thought was their complete monopoly, and they were kind of asserting that kind of control over the system. Now, eventually these things kind of were eroded because the monopolies don't really serve anyone other than the company who actually controls the monopoly. So they would typically run afoul of things like the actual customers themselves, because for the users of a system like this, it is really not helpful to not have any innovation going on, to not have any competition. It's bad for the end consumer. But also it's bad for pretty much everybody else. It's bad for anyone trying to use the system because they can no longer improve it. They can't build on top of it. They can only have what the one provider wants to sell them. But also even the governments themselves would end up being subject to these restrictions and this kind of control that was now being foisted upon them. So often these kinds of monopolies, if they're in an area of communication or software which is considered of great public importance, usually the control of the monopoly ends up being legislated away into a sort of public utility. But this is something that until that happens, there's a lot of kind of frustration that goes on here, and there's a lot of lost innovation potential and freedom. So it is something that we should all sort of be worried about all the time, because these come and go very frequently, and they are big concerns for what we actually can do. Now, sure, that telecommunications example is very old. That goes back several decades to when those issues were really, really big. Nowadays, though, we still see the same thing come about. Now, a couple decades ago, we've all been familiar with game consoles. They've been around for quite a while now, some number of decades. And they're actually kind of built the same way. You actually buy the device from some company that actually sells game consoles. But you can't just write software for it. You can't think, okay, I'm going to make a great game for this and I'm going to, sell 1 million copies. Not really. You don't actually it's not something that you just take and start using. If you're actually trying to build something for it, you actually have to get a license from the owner of the whole platform, the actual game console manufacturer, to actually make games for it. And the reason for this in their case is that they actually often sell the hardware below cost, especially when they're first releasing it. And they recoup that loss on the licensing fees they get. So they take a cut of the sales of all the games. And this is how they make money. So it's part of their business model that actually allows the device, the actual physical machine itself, to get into the hands of lots of consumers, because that increases their market size. And then with a large market, they actually can sell these titles on top of it, and that's how they make their money. But this can be a problem if you wanted to be, say, a small independent developer wanting to do something you think would be great on this platform. You might not be able to. You might not have the clout to negotiate the licensing agreement with them. You might not have the size for them to really think it's worth bothering with you. Or how are they going to actually publish and distribute something which they don't think has any real big name behind it? So this can actually limit a lot of what you get in those environments. And it's why historically things like independent game developers usually were more seen on PCs. These days, some of the consoles are they have some strategies for that, but still, they are the vast minority in those worlds. Now, there's more recent examples of this that come up as well, which are kind of based around the same idea. Things like eReaders, for example. A lot of those are actually tied to the online bookstore of whatever company manufactured them. So you're not so much buying a machine to read digital books. You're buying a shopping cart that you can use at their store. This is frustrating because it means then that, okay, if you have exclusive publisher distribution, say, well, now that means you need several different e-readers, because depending on which book you're reading, you might only be able to get it at one of the stores, or maybe only one of the stores operates in your country, or something like that. There's some really strange limitations that start being imposed upon you, which don't really make sense. They make sense for the bottom line of whoever's producing this, but not in terms of you as an actual user. And these can be very frustrating. Another very common example of this that we see these days is in Apple's iOS platform, which is a perfect example of a walled garden. It's again similar to how the game consoles worked, but they actually go a little further because they actually compete on top of the platform they've created as well. So not only will they decide that, oh, they want a cut of all your sales and you can only distribute through them, which is a rule they have, but also if they don't like what you're doing, either it's something they don't think is in line with what they want their platform to be known for, or if it's maybe an area that they want to get into and they don't want to compete with you, they can at any point just say no. And they're completely within their rights to do that because they built everything and they own everything and they can kind of tell you what to do there. So the users themselves are, again, just largely buying shopping carts that they can use at this one store. And the developers as well have to pay this cut of their sales just for the privilege of being able to sell their items at that store. And this limits a lot of the innovation you can see there, and it's part of why a lot of people don't use those products, because they don't feel like they own it. They feel as though they're going to pay a couple $100 for a shopping cart, and that's not something they actually want. So these are all examples of where this actually comes about in terms of physical hardware, and how those are more like appliances in a lot of cases. Now, for the most part, the PC world has been fairly immune to this. Historically, it was something where it actually operated as something which is not a closed system, something that we refer to as an open platform, which is kind of the opposite, which is when everything's kind of a little bit more a la carte. You kind of get the pieces you want and put them together. So you buy a computer, you buy an operating system, and then you buy software on top of it. You need new software, you find someone who can build that software and you pay them to build it for you, and then you've got these things that do what you want. No one's having to pay some extra intermediary for anything other than what they're buying from them. I bought the hardware from you, so I pay you for that, and that's it. I bought the operating system from you, so I pay you for that, and that's it. Maybe I'll buy services from somebody who also sold me the device, but it's optional. There was no need to lock everyone into everything. And that's why you saw a lot of innovation in those areas and a lot of competition, and why it's been very good for the consumer in that space. But now we're kind of going into a new area. It's not all about just having a device that you run software on. It's about connecting things through the internet. And to the point where sometimes your computer itself might not actually do anything unless it's connected to the internet, maybe even a specific company's online services. Again, we're slowly turning the computer into that shopping cart again. And you see this in some platforms that are coming about these days. But it's also very obvious when you look at how actual online services themselves work. Some of them are set up like these walled gardens. Something like a modern social network. Those are based around the same idea, saying that, okay, you have to be a user within our system to interact within our system. And then when you're inside that system, we control what the software is, we control what's allowed to be said and how it's allowed to be said and who you're allowed to say that with. And of course, we're also listening in on everything that happens. So you're not paying monetarily anymore in most cases. For these online services, they're usually paid for through advertising. So you're paying with your time, with your eyes, and the exposure it's giving the advertisements that actually prop up these systems. But what you're paying for is just a cage to sit in. It's not something that you can actually do whatever you want. No, you can do whatever they tell you can do. And the ability to interoperate across that wall that they put around this, the wall of the garden, is very constrained to what they actually think is in their best interests. Again, it's not about the consumer, it's about the company. So they do everything that matters for them. And that makes sense, but it's why you need to be aware of it and realizing that, okay, that might not be optimal. And another kind of a related issue is the various cloud platforms that show up, where they're trying to say things like, oh, you can have this scalable online solution that does various things you need and kind of shows up in various geographies when you need it to. But when you write this, it can only run on our stuff because it's going to be totally different for you to put this anywhere else. And there is no compatibility between those. If you wanted to put multiple copies of the system you're building online, they would be distinct. An example that came up in a recent talk I did was saying that if you had, say, the source code for Facebook, and you decide, okay, fine, I'll run it myself, that's not actually going to be you running Facebook, because it's not about the software. It's about who's inside the walled garden. These walled gardens are not made to interoperate. So you'd have your own version of Facebook, which no one else would use. And so that's the concern with that, and why even things like open source don't on their own solve this problem. So, of course, we've been trying to build solutions to this. Now, every time one of these problems comes about, some people do try and solve it because it's either a great business opportunity, or because they personally don't like people controlling what they're doing, or because they just think that ideologically the world should be a more kind of open and interoperable place. So they try and solve these problems because it's important to them. And you can see this in examples like the cloud platform problem I was describing, where some people are doing things like deploying OpenStack, say, which is an open platform for developing things like that. Now, it doesn't describe interoperability, but it just describes, okay, you can actually take your kind of web presence that you want to, this application you want to build, and you can run it anywhere. It's not tied to one vendor's system. It's not a walled garden. It's tied to one kind of technology, but one you can actually deploy anywhere you want. No one controls it. In social networks, we see kind of the same thing, where there's companies like, or groups like, say, Diaspora, or even what I'm trying to do with Open Autonomy, where it's all about actually trying to break down those boundaries and say that, yes, we can actually build these systems without walls. We can actually interoperate on the internet the way it used to be, the way that you didn't have to log in everywhere just to interact. You just read things and maybe write them. Maybe you've got user accounts in various places, but it's all free form, it's all open. No one's selling you the whole widget. Nothing's coming from the Acme brand intranet or anything like that. It's something that everyone just interoperates with together. So for these reasons, I think it's an important thing, and something we need to actually we need to look at more closely as we go forward, because these are always going to be concerns we need to worry about. And at this point in time, we're looking at things like the actual app stores or the online walled gardens through social networks as kind of the concerns that we have of today, which in the future we're going to be frustrated by. So that's what I do with my day with Open Autonomy, is trying to solve those, and there's several other examples of that are being done. And we're all trying to solve these problems, but basically that's what it means whenever one of us refers to the walled garden or the problems of the walled garden. So if there's any questions, of course, feel free to post a comment here or send me an email, and I'll reply to it, or if you want me to do another talk about something specific, send me a request and I'll do what I can. Thanks. Bye.